Nearly 200 countries around the world, including Canada, now have 8 years to set aside almost one-third of their land and marine territories for conservation. The landmark new biodiversity deal was reached at the United Nations COP15 talks in Montreal on Monday. The UN says 17% of the world's land and 10% of its marine areas are currently protected. Canada has protected about 14% of both. With us to discuss the details of this new global agreement and what it means for the future is Mr. Ritchlin, Nature Director and Director General for Western Canada with the David Suzuki Foundation. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Good afternoon. It's really nice to be with you.
Great to have you here. We know you were at the conference now, and of course you were there receiving or participating with the intro and the agreement itself. So can you give our viewers a bit of an overview of the main planks of this global agreement?
Yeah, I can. There are four key goals and about 23, well, exactly 23 targets that are supposed to get us to a world by 2050 where we are living in balance with nature and supplying humans' needs, and nature can continue to help people. So a few of the biggest things that came out of this agreement was the deep integration of Indigenous people, their rights, their knowledge, and their ability to manage their territories. A real commitment to halting and reversing nature loss and species loss, which was a big win, as well as some new elements around funding for the developing world, which was a huge part of what we were hoping to get out of that.
Now, I mean,
Another thing I would, I apologize. One thing I would say is for the first time, pesticides, plastics, and pollution were recognized as a big part of what's driving biodiversity loss.
Interesting. That is an interesting point. Now, how significant is this agreement overall to global conservation efforts?
This is the next 10 years of action plan underneath what's called the Convention on Biological Diversity. So every country, over 190 countries, committed to being part of this. They each have to go make their own national action plans, though, and here at home in Canada, we'll be working very hard to make sure that Canada is stringent and is kept up with.
And I appreciate you bringing up Canada. We're talking about global agreements here, but let's bring this to people living in this country specifically. So what does this deal at COP15 mean for people living here?
Well, we really have to get on to figuring out how to protect 30% of our land and our oceans, and the current government is making efforts on that. We're enabling a lot more Indigenous participation by funding Indigenous protected areas and a national guardians program for Indigenous people. And we've got to really start looking at how to reduce the damage. So the halting part is the biggest piece we've got to get to. Old growth forests, coastal areas, grasslands and peatlands that store lots of carbon. We've got to figure out how to retune our economy so that we're putting money into restoration and directing funds to that rather than just extraction.
Going back to the talks themselves, I know there was a bit of disagreement around the compensation agreement or arrangement between developed and developing countries. So I guess, has what the UN Deputy Secretary General called a trust deficit been addressed in this conference?
Well, it was really apparent at the conference. There was a walkout by the developing nations. There was quite a bit of controversy when at 3:30 in the morning, the global framework was adopted, and some African countries were upset about the process. But ultimately, we did get some really good commitments. Canada has become the 7th largest contributor to what's known as the Global Environment Facility, which will help bring funds to the developing world. But, the rich world got rich in many ways through colonial practices that extracted wealth from the developing world. And for them to be able to protect their areas that are left and still give their people a good quality of life, we need to help.
I suppose if we move on now to, say, the COP15 conference and its agreement, does this conference serve as a good model for future conservation efforts worldwide? Despite the agreements, there was, or the disagreements, there was an agreement reached. So is this a good model?
Well, this sets the pace for the next 10 years in the Global Conservation Agreement. We also have a High Seas Treaty coming up and something called Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdictions, the BBNJ. So if we can get the kind of agreement and the kind of collaboration that we saw eventually come forward here, remember that we need to supply resources and really zero in on the fact that businesses and industries have got to be put under the microscope. It can't all be just about governments and NGOs. The companies that make money extracting from the natural world need to be part of this as well.
Well, Mr. J. Ritchlin, thank you for joining us on Forum Daily today. There's a lot to take in there and a lot more we'll have to check back on as this agreement unfolds.